Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Maryborough's historic Bond store. The Fraser Coast Regional Council acknowledges to the east the Bachelor and to the west the Kabi people, their connection to country, land, sea and sky, and recognises the many places of cultural, spiritual, social and economic significance in the community. We pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The Fraser Coast Regional Council also acknowledges other First Nation Aboriginals and the Torres Strait Islander people who reside in the Fraser Coast region. Maryborough has a very important historical background. We were first settled in 1847 by George Ferber. The following year, Edgar Aldridge set on the opposite side of the river. Maryborough became a very prominent, important port very early in the piece. By the mid-1850s, the land where the old township site now sits was deemed to be unsuitable for future expansion. They also had problems with deeper river port areas which were down in this area here. So by the mid-1850s the lands in this area were resurveyed, ready for land sales, and those first land sales happened here in Maryborough in the 1860s. Maryborough became part of what was Queensland from 1859 onwards, and at that time the new government then declared that Maryborough, Rockhampton and Gladstone were to become warehousing ports. So that was for ports for bond stores such as this building, which would look at the imports and exports and those taxable duties that were payable. At that same time, Maryborough was also gazetted an area where immigrants could come into the port of Maryborough through this port here. We had over 22,000 immigrants came into Australia through Maryborough between the 1860s and 1900. And a lot of those immigrants went into other areas. Some of them stayed here where their descendants still live in this region. Tonight we have a diverse group of speakers who each have their own distinct style of telling stories, all the stories that they have passionately researched over a number of years. Our next speaker is Greig Bolderrow. Greig was born in Maryborough and admits that he never really ever found a good reason to leave the place. He spent his working life at radio station 4MB, starting as announcer 2 days after completing grade 12 at the Maryborough Boys High. He worked his way up the ladder, becoming general manager in 1984. On his retirement in 2017, he was general manager of the radio and television stations of Southern Cross Austereo for the Wide Bay. Greig is passionate about the Fraser Coast. He is chair of the Fraser Coast Tourism and Events. He established Maryborough's Walk of Achievers outside in Wall Street and was deputy chair of the Gallipoli to Armistice Memorial Committee and still takes school children and tours through the memorial. He's on several other committees and boards throughout the Fraser Coast and is one of the characters, the Gauger, who appears here in the Bond story in the Tipples and Tails. So welcome, Greig.
Thank you. Good evening. 3 stories for you this evening. The first, the story of John Carn Bidwell, botanist and government man. John Carn Bidwell was born in Exeter in England in February 1815, the oldest son of Joseph Green Bidwell and Charlotte née Carn. He arrived in Sydney on the Arachne in 1838 with his sister Elizabeth when he was just 22 years of age. He applied for 1,800 acres of land on the Manning River at 5 shillings an acre. The price was later raised to 12 shillings an acre, and despite the assurances from the governor that all previous land surveyed would be made available at the original cost, Bidwell waited in vain for the price to drop. Frustrated by the delays, the wanderlust hit again, and he travels to New Zealand, Tahiti, and several times to Moreton Bay, all the time collecting plants and cataloguing them. He sailed again for England in 1841, taking with him his plant collection, including seeds and seedlings of the bunya pine. It's known locally around Moreton Bay as Pinus petriana. It was identified by the famous explorer Andrew Petrie. When shown to Sir William Hooker in England, he identifies it as an Oricoria, and what's more, distinct from the South American variety, and he names it Oricoria bidwellii, after what he mistakenly believes is its discoverer. Bidwell has a book published called Ramblings in New Zealand in 1841, and he returns to Sydney with another sister, Mary, in 1843. The colony is at an exciting stage. Landholders and squatters are pushing north, west and south. The colony is expanding. With his reputation as a botanist of note, Bidwell is appointed the first director of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney. Some months later, a bureaucratic bungle is unearthed, and it's discovered that the Secretary of State in London has actually appointed Charles Moore. So John Carn Bidwell takes his problem to the Governor and requests that, should a commissionership become available, he would be interested. And so it is that in 1848 he's appointed the government's most northerly officer, Commissioner of Lands for Wide Bay. Now, not only is he Commissioner of Lands, he's also the Harbour Master, the Magistrate and the Registrar of Births, Deaths and Marriages. To say that he didn't immediately endear himself to the locals would be an understatement. He arrived wearing a white hat and carrying a parasol, and immediately declared that from this day forth the Governor wishes that the river be known as the Mary River, in honour of the Governor's wife. He also chooses to build his barracks 4 miles downstream from the burgeoning township on the banks of Tanana Creek because he deemed the land more fertile and better suited to his plans to establish a botanic gardens. Or could the real reason have been that he was as unimpressed with the locals as they were of him? In a letter home to his brother, he wrote, "This is the most infernal place possible. There has been nothing but drunkenness here since I came. I fear my magisterial duties will be troublesome." Thank goodness we changed. It was a lively little town, and even though we were on the other side of the world, the English blood still coursed through our veins. At one stage, Bidwell was challenged to a public duel to the death. He'd spoken out at a dinner party about John McTaggart from Kilkeven Station, who Bidwell believed was selling his men sly grog. Bidwell refused the duel. Word got back to McTaggart, who stormed into town. Bidwell saw him coming and told the gathering, "That man is coming to commit an assault on me, prevent him." But the aggrieved Scot wasn't to be denied. He pushed his way through the crowd and struck Bidwell on the shoulder with a whip. In the hearing in Brisbane, Bidwell did admit that had he been carrying a gun that day, he would have shot McTaggart. McTaggart was found guilty and was sentenced to 7 days' imprisonment to be served in Sydney. Maryborough, lively, yes, but somewhat isolated. There were several tracks out of town, but they were a long way round and tedious. What was needed was a shorter coastal overland route to Moreton Bay, and so it was in 1852 that Bidwell set out with a party to create just such a route. He set out to Tahiti Station, about 4 miles to the east of Tyro. They followed the ridge that divided the Mary from Tanana Creek into what is now the heart of Gympie. Here, the party camped for some days while they constructed a bridge to get the bullocks and supplies across, and it was here that Bidwell, while working in the creek bed, is said to have discovered gold. That's 15 years before this discovery that's attributed to Nash. No time to take his discovery further. Bidwell and his party push on, and now disaster strikes. Bidwell takes a wrong bearing, confusing Mount Karura with Mount Biawa, one of the Glasshouse Mountains, and they're lost. It goes from bad to worse. Some men desert and are speared by unfriendly Aborigines. Supplies are running as short as tempers, and the party decides to split up. Bidwell and a man called Slade start out on foot with the intention of reaching Durandur Station. The comedy of errors continues. Bidwell loses his compass, and they soon find that Durandur Station is much further away than they first thought. They're now hopelessly lost in very thick scrub, and all they have is a billhook that's far too small and inadequate for the task at hand. Supplies are scarce. The two survive on native honey, berries, grubs and a bird they managed to shoot. By now they're too weak to continue. 2 search parties are sent out. The search parties get lost too. With hope fading, the pair are rescued by friendly Aborigines who guide and carry them to Durandur. Bidwell and Slade now rest up and regain some strength. Bidwell purchases some horses and obviously abandons any further attempts to get to Moreton Bay. He's anxious to get back to Maryborough and then recover his dray and equipment. He discovers that on the 6th day after leaving, the remainder of his men, they'd been attacked by hostile Aborigines and the equipment had been stolen. He's now a broken man, and the time spent lost in the bush has taken its toll. He's a shell of his former self, and he never regained his health. At age 38, 2 years after the fateful foray into the bush, he died. His He's buried in Cran Street, Maryborough, his grave overlooking his magnificent gardens. Charles Moore from Sydney Botanic Gardens, the man who took the job that Bidwell was originally offered, was sent to Maryborough to collect plants of worth from the gardens. He deemed that there was nothing of botanical interest and returned to Sydney with a handful of cuttings and some seeds. John Carn Bidwell's grave was marked with a lonjan tree and 4 bunya pines that have now been ring-barked and destroyed. Though it seems not, his legacy will live on. He's credited with introducing that summer treat, the mango, into Australia. Now, there's some speculation about this, and it's thought that the first mango tree was grown around Redcliffe, but the sandy soil was unsuited and it died. Bidwell's choice of the fertile land at Tanana Creek has proven to be sound. The mangoes he planted there were still bearing fruit 130 years later. He introduced passion fruit and also sugar cane that proved to be a boom for the Queensland economy through the 20th century and the 21st. Charles Moore also sent seeds collected at Tanana to Java, England, France and South Africa. And so it is that the government man with a passion for plants influenced the world. Thank you. And I thought we'd have a bit of fun with this one. It's called Everything Old is New Again. The Great War is over. The world has lost over 40 million people as a result. 62,000 Australians that answered the call never returned. But now it's 1919 and our men and women are returning, but they're bringing with them a killer to rival the war that they've just left. It's called the Spanish flu, and it's undoubtedly had its origins in the rat-infested trenches of the Western Front. It's been raging in Europe since 1918, but as the troops are sent home, it's spreading across the world. In early 1919, there was a massive outbreak of flu in Melbourne, undoubtedly brought in by returning troops, and Sydney too was starting to see cases increase. There were many Queensland soldiers and nurses on the ships that disembarked in the southern cities, and fear started to grow in Maryborough that the disease could move quickly north from Brisbane. The Queensland government has reacted by closing the borders and quarantine stations have been set up at places like Coolangatta and Tenterfield. Anyone coming to Queensland is forced to spend time at these quarantine stations. People are wearing masks. In Maryborough, the Chronicle is urging people not to panic, and the medicos are saying that there is little reason for concern. When the steamer the SS Bopple, belonging to Wilson Hart Sawmill, arrived in the Town Reach on the 28th of January, she was ordered to anchor midstream and the crew had to undergo strict medical testing and were confined to the boat for 7 days. In Brisbane, the waterside workers were refusing to work on vessels that hadn't been passed by health authorities. But still no panic in Maryborough. An inoculation centre has been set up, but few people are using it. The situation was changing rapidly. Within a few days, it became painfully obvious that there would be a shortage of vaccines. People started to realise that if they wanted to get a jab, they'd have to act fast. In Maryborough, one man's arrested on suspicion of illegally crossing the border and not going through quarantine. The doctors meet and devise a practical scheme for mutual assistance on the part of doctors in the case of an outbreak of influenza and the lines on which they will proceed in combating it. On the same day, the exhibition building at the showgrounds in Alice Street is set up ready for the reception of patients. A suggestion is made that it would be better to have set up at the Newtown School, as it was on higher ground and had better drainage. This is knocked back as there was little room for the extra accommodation for doctors and nurses. So the showgrounds is the go. Several patients are admitted, but none, it seems, has the dreaded flu. First patient is admitted on May 7. Another, a police constable, admitted on May 9. And on May 11th, a railway porter aged 17 is also admitted. The Maryborough show is to be held on the 23rd and the 24th. And it's decided by the Show Society to cancel it. By the 21st, the epidemic had spread to Brisbane, and in Maryborough 2 more people had been admitted to the isolation ward at the showgrounds. News came that Kilkevin had experienced a sudden rash of cases. Some 70 or 80 people had contracted the disease, and the Kilkevin Council requested emergency assistance from Maryborough. One of the Kilkivan patients, John Wex, was transferred to Wandai, where unfortunately he later died, and he was the first Wide Bay death. There's now an outbreak on Fraser Island, where 2 people contracted the disease from a steamer which had arrived from Sydney. By the 26th of May, there were so many cases in Maryborough that they couldn't be accommodated at the isolation centre. Dr Brown was the municipal health officer, and he ordered people who were infected to stay home. On the same day, the Maryborough Boys Grammar School was closed after an outbreak among the students. On the 29th of May, the first death occurred at a private home, and the number of patients was steadily increasing, placing severe strain on the medical and nursing staff. A week or 2 later, on June 10, the situation was getting worse. More than 80 people had been treated at the emergency hospital, and the Mayor, Alderman Worry, said there was barely a house in Maryborough that didn't have someone who had contracted the virus. By the 18th of June, there had been 5 deaths in Maryborough, and another occurred several weeks later, bringing the tally to 6. It went as fast as it came. By mid-July, cases were on the wane, and many of the schools that had closed were now reopening. The Maryborough Council later applauded the work of doctors and nurses, and as reported in the Chronicle, awarded the municipal health officer a handsome smoker's outfit. Very appropriate gift for a health officer, I would have thought. But Matron Webber and Sister Murray each received, according to the Chronicle, beautiful ladies' travelling bags. It was the deadliest plague in the world after the Great Plague in Europe of the 1300s. It killed at least 50 million people. Who would have thought? State borders are closed, quarantine stations are set up, people are wearing masks, people are arrested for crossing the border illegally, schools are closing, there's a shortage of vaccines, the show's been cancelled. But hey, it's 1919. Couldn't happen again, could it?
Really? Well.
He was born to simple country folk in Maryborough in 1898, and he grew up as a hard-working farm boy on the family property at Owenilla. Richard Warren did well at school, but with the tasks that needed to be completed on the farm before and after school, he didn't have much time for sport. When time allowed, he loved a game of tennis. In March 1916, he enlisted and was in a select group of recruits who were known as the Fair Dinkhams. These new recruits were well aware of what to expect. They'd heard of the carnage at Gallipoli, and the romanticism of war had died. But they volunteered anyway. In May 1916, he boarded the troop ship Demosthenes, bound for England, and eventually in September made it to the Western Front. Nothing in his training could have prepared him for the sights, sounds and conditions he was about to experience. France was entering the worst winter in 100 years, freezing cold, constant damp, knee-deep mud, and the constant presence of death was the daily norm. In February 1917, Richard and a party were carrying rations to the front line when the scream of an artillery shell pierced the night. He and his carrying partner dived for shelter. It was close. So close, in fact, that a red-hot piece of shrapnel shattered the urn of boiling water they were carrying and drenched Warren's feet with its contents. He pleaded with medics not to send him back to Blighty, but they deemed his injury in need of specialist treatment, and on the 8th of February 1917 he was admitted to Norfolk War Hospital, where he stayed for 8 weeks. But you can't keep a good Owenilla farm boy down for long. By October he was back in France. In November he had a brush with military discipline. He was charged with the serious crime of stealing. It wasn't money or his mate's possessions. It was 4 pounds of apples that he'd given to the members of his section. He was found guilty and sentenced to 1 day's detention. 1918, and finally the tide is turning. The Allies had the Germans on the run. At one point, though, the 31st became pinned down by particularly accurate German artillery fire. The field was strewn with Aussie wounded. Richard and his good mate Richard Stutz, also from Owenilla, went out under heavy fire and dragged their wounded mates back to safety. Both were awarded the military medal. And it's ironic that after the war, Stutz was to marry Richard's sister. Although the Germans were retreating with our diggers close on their heels, the Aussies remained under constant fire. Warren was with a Lewis gun section that sortied forward to engage a troublesome German artillery battery. They engaged with accurate small arms fire, serious enough to have the Germans abandon their post. This respite allowed the 31st to continue forward. Private Richard Warne was recommended for a bar to his military medal, but it was not approved. We're all aware of what happened at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November. The war is over, but Private Richard Warne, military medal, would have to wait for his turn to get passage back to Owenula. He went to England, where he took in the sights and sounds and celebrations of the Allied victory. And finally, the order that he'd been waiting for 3.5 years came. He was coming home. As the ship neared the coastline of Australia, many of the diggers would swear that they could smell the gum trees. Richard presented himself for a final medical board, and on the 22nd of August 1919 was passed fit with no disabilities. He sent a telegram home saying that he would catch the first available train from Brisbane and would be at the front door on the afternoon of the 25th. He'd arranged to travel with George Black, also of the 31st. They'd become good mates over the past 18 months and had each other's backs both in and out of the line. By a stroke of luck, Richard was released early and thought he'd surprise his family by catching an earlier train, this one arriving early in the morning of the 25th. Early in the trip, Richard learned the unbelievable. The train was an express, stopping at major stations only. It wouldn't be stopping at Owenula. He pleaded with the driver to make an unscheduled stop, but the driver refused, saying the best he could do was slow the train down so Richard could jump. And so it was decided. As the train approached Owenula at 5 a.m, he and Black walked to the door. They shook hands, said their goodbyes and promised to keep in touch. As the platform came into view, Richard threw his kit bag, which landed safely. Richard followed, and fate stepped in. The train was travelling too fast, and he'd missed the platform altogether. He bounced along the ground and hit a large rock with such force it threw him under the train. The wheel shattered the lower portion of his right leg. He was gashed about the head, had a compound fracture of the skull, and his body was covered in severe gravel rash. It's now 7 o'clock. And Eva Lay, the wife of the local linesman, has come to the station to unlock the gates. She spots the kit bag on the platform, but the rest of the station is empty. Curiosity gets the better of her, and on making her way down the track, she finds the bloodied body of the young soldier. As she looks closer, she can see a slight rise and fall in his chest. It's impossible, but he's still alive. She races to the nearest farmhouse for help. The farm is that of the Warne family. And on arrival, Richard and Claire Warne are faced with the unimaginable. The battered soldier is their son. An ambulance is called. It arrives and they place Richard in the back and speed into town with Clara cradling her son's head in her hands. As the ambulance approached Maryborough Hospital, Private Richard Warne, military medal, lost his final battle and died in his mother's arms. The good citizens of Maryborough contributed to a fund to erect a memorial. It stands at the Maryborough Cemetery today, a magnificent bright white headstone featuring crossed 303s. His mother never got over the death of her firstborn, but she endured another 41 years of unbearable torture of his loss before she was buried beside him in 1960. Finally, together again. Thank you.
And now we have Carmel Murdoch. Carmel came to Maryborough in 1973. In 1998, she became an ambassador for Maryborough City Council, and then in 2008, she became ambassador for the Fraser Coast region. Carmel has been involved with promotion and tourism under the guise of a number of characters named Mary. Carmel has had a love of history since she was a little girl. Since marrying a local whose family came to Maryborough in 1873, genealogy has been one of her interests. Carmel said, "My grandchildren, Kira and Hunter, are the 7th generation of the Murdoch family to live in Maryborough. Maryborough has such a rich heritage, and the stories about early residents and the history are fascinating." Tonight you'll hear stories about Mary Heritage, Council Ambassador and Tour Guide, who, along with the town crier, fires the time cannon. Other Mary characters include Mary Christmas, Mary Poppins, the Mary Widow, who co-hosted the ghost tours at Mavis Bank. Also included in the series of characters are Mary River, or Mary Rivers, my apologies, Steampunk Mary and Mary Rose. So welcome, Carmel.
Thank you, Ken. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, viewers and my fellow presenters. Maryborough has a rich heritage which I discovered when researching hundreds of topics for the various tours with which I became involved, and we are very fortunate to have the Maryborough Wide Bay Burdekin District Historical Society, and Ken is the president, the Maryborough District Family History Society, and John is the president. Do we have the president here of the Maryborough Family Heritage Institute tonight? No? An excellent Fraser Coast Regional Council library and a number of local historians and many others, all of whom are happy to give their time to pass on all of their knowledge. Stories are meant to be shared, and my guided tours are the way in which I share my stories of Maryborough. When you see a guide in heritage costume, you know you're going on an historical tour. My stories this evening are from the perspective of a tour guide, and I would like to share with you a couple of those stories and the way in which I use my costumes to enable me to present them to visitors and locals alike with the many hats of Mary. Now, my costume this evening is that of a lady from the 1850s. Ken has already told you how important that period was when we became a port of entry, and many of the ladies who stepped ashore onto Australian soil during that time would have been dressed as I am this evening. Now, the customs officer of the day from that time, Richard Sheridan, lobbied the government for a time cannon. In 1877, Premier Douglas and his party were on Maryborough Island in the Torres Strait, and they were heading back to board their ship when someone stubbed their toe on something buried in the sand, and they all thought, oh beauty, buried treasure! So they dug away madly and they found this little cannon. So they cleaned it up and gave it to the people of Maryborough as a Christmas gift. It was first fired in March 1878, and well, you might ask, why did they want a time cannon? No one asked. There you go. Why did they want a time cannon? Now, these people who emigrated here came from all different countries throughout the world, with different lengths of daylight hours, different time zones, etc. So by firing a time cannon each day at 1 o'clock, that would notify the workers in the fields that they could stop for lunch. The ship's captains could reset their chronometers before they sailed out to sea, and the mums and dads who'd forgotten to wind up their clocks and watches could do so. Because you have to remember, in those days there were no digital watches, there were no TVs or phones or anything where you could find out what the time was. So by hearing the time cannon, it went, oh, there's the 1 o'clock cannon, I'll go and set my watch. So it was fired each day at the traditional time of 1 o'clock until 1898, when there was a depression, and due to lack of funds to pay the person to fire it and to pay for the shot, they ceased to fire it every day, and they only fired it on official occasions. And eventually it fell into disuse. Then, we'll fast forward a bit and we'll go to 1987. Maryborough was planning to have a display in the Communities of Australian Pavilion at World Expo, which was in Brisbane in 1988. Now, the question was asked, how do we attract people to come to our pavilion? And someone said, let's fire the time cannon! So, it was then that they discovered that the original cannon was one of 300 that was cast by the Dutch East India Company in 1750. They couldn't tell us on which ship it was placed, nor could they tell us how it came to be on Maryborough Island. So we can only surmise that it was possibly off a shipwreck or a ship that was being pursued by pirates. Now, where the pirates come into it, if you were on a ship and you were being pursued by pirates, then what you would do is throw everything overboard that you didn't need, and that would make the ship lighter so that it could then come up higher out of the water and go faster as a result. So that was why I said perhaps it was pirates. So when they discovered the age of the original cannon, Olds Engineering cast alloy replicas which were fired at World Expo and are still fired today. The original is right upstairs here in the Bond store. Now, they decided they needed to have someone at World Expo to assist Mayor Peters and Councillor Alan Brown to fire the cannon. And they also needed to have someone to give information out to all the people who came into the pavilion. So someone said, well, who can we have? And some bright spark said, we're on the Mary River and we're a heritage city. So the character Mary Heritage evolved. So that's this hat that I'm wearing now. Mary Heritage at Expo was a lady called Del Jensen, and when Expo was finished, Del left and Barbara Barringhouse became Mary Heritage. She was joined by our town crier, the late Reg Lade, in 1989 when the Ancient and Honourable Guild of Australian Town Criers was formed. Next followed Marjorie Green, and then 18 months later Barbara returned, and she remained until December 1997. I became Mary Heritage in February 1998. In those days, the roles were of ambassadors for Maryborough. Now, there were no set hours, and some weeks you worked 40 hours plus, day and night. We attended all official functions with the Mayor. We went to the markets every Thursday where we fired the time cannon at 1 o'clock. We also started many sporting games and opened new businesses with the firing of the time cannon. We opened the show with the firing of the time cannon, and we fired it in parades and festivals here in Maryborough and in other towns and city. Now, I've met most Prime Ministers and Premiers during the period of time that I've been working, but one always stands out for me. We were in City Hall, and the Mayor got up to address the throng, and he was wearing his gown and his chain of office, etc. So Reg went out and rang his bell. "Oh, yay!" he cried. "Pray silence for His Worship the Mayor, Councillor Alan Brown." I walked over to Alan and escorted him to the microphone, and he turned around and he winked at the PM and he said, "I bet you don't get that in Canberra." Now, I've worked with town criers Reg Lade, his assistant Stephen Batty, who became the crier for the former Wooku, Tyro and Hervey Bay shires, and that was prior to amalgamation. And I presently work with town crier for the Fraser Coast Regional Council, Ken Ashford. I have attended 15 National Town Crier Championships, 1 World Championship in the UK, 1 World Invitational competition in Victoria. I have co-hosted 1 National and 1 World Championships right here in Maryborough, and I have won Best Dressed Attendant of a Town Crier on 13 occasions. Now, in 1998, I was approached by the Visitor Information Centre to conduct bus tours for visiting companies. They rang me up and they said, "Gosh, we've had an unusual request." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" And they said, "This bus company, they want to come to Maryborough and they want somebody to get on the bus and take them around and show them things." And I said, "Oh, I'll do that." They said, "Will you really?" I said, "Yeah, no worries at all." So I researched people, places, tourist attractions and events. I devised and timed routes, planned itineraries and conducted the tours. Now, these tours could be for 1 hour, 1 day, 5 days or a week. It was wonderful, loved it. Now, when you're on a bus, you can't stop in front of each building. So the information has to be concise and accurate and delivered just before you go past the building, and along with instructions as to which side of the street the people on the bus need to look. And you also have to give directions to the bus driver. And as well as that, you also have to answer questions put to you along the route, as well as information to make it interesting. Now, also in 1998, Merry Christmas came into being. Maryborough City Council hosted a Light Up Our City competition for the residents and businesses. They would light up City Hall with a concert and entertainers such as Carmel and Troy Cassadaly and various other stars. Anyone remember them coming here to Maryborough? Yeah, it was wonderful, wasn't it? And I also conducted bus tours of the city lights. Now, I still attend a scaled-back Maryborough Light Up City Hall, and I also attend carols by candlelight in Queen's Park as Merry Christmas with Santa. So that's my second hat. Now, on the 9th of August in 1899, in Maryborough, Queensland, a baby girl was born to the bank manager of the Australian Joint Stock Bank, Travers Goff, and his wife Pamela, whom they named Helen Lyndon Goff. Young Helen was about a year old when the family was transferred. They departed by train for Brisbane, and her father went to work in the bank in Ipswich. He was later transferred to Ellora, where he died when Helen was aged 7. Now, there were no supporting mothers' benefits in those days, so young Helen and her siblings went with her mother to Bowral to live with a great aunt. Now, we believe that this is the character, that this is the person on whom she based her character, Mary Poppins. She went to school in Sydney where she studied journalism and acting, and when she finished her studies, she joined a troupe of actors who travelled throughout regional towns in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, and she even performed on the stage in City Hall in A Midsummer Night's Dream. She adopted the stage name of Pamela Lyndon Travers, the first names of both parents and her own middle name. She travelled with the troupe to New Zealand, where she also wrote a couple of stories for a newspaper. Upon her return to Australia, she saved her money and went to live in the UK. She wrote 8 books about Mary Poppins. 6 of those contained a total of 36 short stories, another about the characters, and yet another which contained recipes of all things. The titles of her books were, in 1934, Mary Poppins, 1935, Mary Poppins Comes Back, 1943, Mary Poppins Opens the Door, and in 1952, Mary Poppins in the Park, 1962, Mary Poppins from A to Z, 1975, Mary Poppins in the Kitchen, and 1982, Mary Poppins in Cherry Tree Lane, and in 1988, Mary Poppins and the House Next Door. She wrote under the name P.L. Travers, as in those days you had a better chance of having your books published if they thought you were a man. So P.L. Travers sounds much more masculine than Helen Lyndon Gough or Pamela Travers, doesn't it? So you can see why she would have done it. And Mary Shepherd illustrated all of her books. Walt Disney took just a few of those stories and made the original movie Mary Poppins in 1964, which starred Julie Andrews. Other stories were added to the 2018 movie Mary Poppins Returns, which starred Emily Blunt. During her teens, while she was in Australia, she began publishing poems in Australian periodicals. She wrote a number of other books as well. As she never married, and there was a bit of conjecture about why she hadn't got married, and in 1939 she adopted a son, Camillus, who was a twin. She had an interesting life and was well travelled, and for a short time she even lived on a Navajo reservation in Arizona. In 1977 she was a recipient of an OBE. She had a love of poetry and mythology, and P.L. died on the 23rd of April in 1996. And following her death, the Mary Poppins musical debuted on the London stage in 2004. Then in 1999, a group of ladies who called themselves the Proud Marys decided to celebrate the birth of P.L. Travers on the anniversary of her 100th birthday. They organised a Mary Poppins morning tea at the Heritage Markets, which included a nanny challenge and a grand parade and kids' games. It was wonderful. I was asked if I would take on the role of Mary Poppins by the Proud Mary's president, Anne Miller, who was also a counsellor. Now, there were no funds to promote this, so I researched the author and read the books, and I went to schools where I would sing and dance and tell stories. None of those very well, but I did it. So by 2005, when we celebrated Maryborough 100 years a city, there were so many people at the Mary Poppins Market Day that there was shuffle room only in the parade. So it was decided the morning tea needed to become a festival. In 2013, I began to conduct morning tea with Mary tours. These continue today. The purchase of the former Australian Joint Stock Bank building by the Fraser Coast Regional Council transformed it into the very popular Story Bank, a bank that trades in stories, a whimsical attraction, which opened in 2019, and it's loved by children and adults alike. I tell stories and conduct tours on Thursday between 11 a.m. and the 1 p.m. firing of the time cannon. Take that one off. Now, in 2001, I began working right here in the Bond store, and I was astonished that people didn't know the existence of the Wharf Street precinct. They'd walk down the street and they'd say, I always used to hang out in the doorway, and I'd pounce on them and invite them in. And they would say, we didn't know this place existed. So I said to my boss at the time, do you mind if I go down and stand outside City Hall every morning at 9 o'clock? And she said, as long as you're here to open the museum by 10. I said, yep, no worries. So that was what we did. And I commenced the free guided walking tours as a way of taking people from City Hall to our museums right here in Wharf Street. Now, due to COVID, these tours have been scaled back, but in spite of COVID, they continue to be popular today, 20 years later, and are conducted by our dedicated volunteers, Ian, Ailsa, Wolfgang, Graham, Eris, Michael and Tony. In 2004, I had been trying to find something which would complement the last Sunday of the month in Queen's Park. Now, the Maryborough District Family History Society, this is the one that John's the president of, they were aware of this, and when they were approached by Tricia Moulds from Rosehill Homestead, they suggested contacting me. So, almost forgot. The next character was the Mary Widow. Now she was fun to play. She was the hostess on the ghostly tours and tales of the Port of Maryborough. I would check off the manifest. I would give the passengers an identity for the evening. They were all dead, of course. And I kept them on time, notified each venue of the ETA, and was the light relief between the venues. This was a bus tour, which was a progressive dinner. Cars were left at Mavis Bank, and they would all get on the bus, and then we would go to Rosehill Homestead for soup and a tour of their haunted house. We would then travel to the Maryborough Monumental Cemetery, where we joined the Maryborough District Family History Society. We had our main course at the Engineers Arms, which was also haunted, as I personally discovered. We would tour Wharf Street with the Night Watchman and return to Mavis Bank for a delicious dessert and a tour of the house. And believe me, it is one of the scariest buildings that you will ever go into. Ask Boldy about it later. Each month the Mary Widow would get on the bus looking for a millionaire. Now, one night I had two on the bus. But one had a crook back and the other one had a wife, so neither one was any good to me. Now, over 11 and a half years, the tour evolved a number of times as various hosts and venues changed, and we hosted our last tour as Mary Widow and Boldy as the Undertaker in January 2016. Now, the next character was Mary Rivers. So she would hang out around Queen's Park and Wharf Street in the dark and conduct tours. And she wasn't the lady of the night. No. Now, the next character there we go. Steampunk Mary. She evolved when Ian Brown wrote The Story Trail. Now, this character also compared the Steam Festa in Queen's Park, and on other occasions I have attended functions as Mary Rose, at the Rose Gardens, of course. So every one of these characters tells different stories, every one. But with the costume that I'm wearing, I won in 2019 in Victoria as the best dressed attendant of a town crier at the Invitational Worlds and the national competition with my costume. And it's a way of talking to people. For example, if you were here with your children and I walked up to the children in a t-shirt and a pair of slacks and started talking to them, you'd think, what's this woman doing here? Whereas children are attracted to the costume. They would come to you and say, oh, I like your pretty dress. And so you'd look at them and say, okay, what have they got? Nice joggers or pretty tops or whatever. And they would then, the mothers, you would say to them, how do you think Mum would go wearing this to do the housework? And so that was a way of doing it. Now, I've loved researching the history of Maryborough for all of these characters, tours, functions and events. But all good things must come to an end, and as I will be 70 in July this year, I am retiring. When I was a little girl, I loved dressing up in all sorts of costumes. I used to write poetry, and I still do. And when I was 10 years old, I wrote an adaptation of Sleeping Beauty for the school play. I also cast the play, made the costumes and the props, which included a spinning wheel made out of a cardboard box. I appeared in school and church plays and in one-off in the Charleville Players. Now, if you had told me then that for 23 years I would dress in costume to promote this beautiful city that I love, I would not have believed you. And I take with me many wonderful memories. Thank you.
First we'll have John Rule. John was born, schooled and commenced work in Maryborough with his first job at 13 years of age delivering the Sunday mail for Anderson's at the hospital with Arnie Twig. John started delivering of the Chronicle during the week and kept a Sunday mail run, starting at 3 a.m, rolling the newspapers, packing them on their bikes and delivering them. After giving away the deliveries of newspaper, John started as a milk delivery boy while still at school. To get out of school, John applied for a job with Boys Department Store where it was agreed that they would let him sit for his junior, but that never happened. John was a successful menswear salesperson for 2 years with Boys and later joined the railway as a lad porter before starting as a night officer role in Ipswich and then transferring back to Mungar. He later transferred to Brisbane, becoming the Secretary of the Railway Union and worked alongside Peter Beattie to save as many jobs as possible. After taking 12 months leave, John and his wife leased the Plainland Hotel for 3 years, later buying the Palace Street Post Office Store and Parcel Run here in Maryborough. After selling the Parcel Run, they bought Maryborough Glass, where he remained until retiring. John has been involved in local rugby league as Assistant Secretary of Maryborough Rugby League, Treasurer of the Western Suburbs 1975 to 77 and President of Maryborough Rugby League Association. John became involved in family history research dating back to the 1870s and is now President of the Maryborough and District Family History Society. Can I ask you to welcome John, please?
Good evening, fellow history lovers. Yes, I'm the henpecked President of the Maryborough District Family History Society. It's like Beauty and the Beast up there. There are so many citizens over the 160 years of Maryborough's history that we could talk about, and there would be many we don't know about. The prominent ones are spoken of regularly, but there are many who rarely get a mention. Some never get a mention. Tonight we thought we would talk on some of the unknown. These are 3 that we selected from the hundreds we reveal on our cemetery tours, which have become very popular. If you haven't done one yet, I recommend you get in while Margaret's still going strong. First subject for tonight is Eliza Baker. She retired to Maryborough after a very interesting life. She was involved here with the Wesley Methodists. Eliza Baker was born in Wales in 1806. Perhaps I better tell you this one. On the 27th of October, Eliza, then aged 48, joined Florence Nightingale as a nurse and sailed for the Crimea aboard the ship Vectis, arriving in Constantinople in November of that year. A total of 229 women were to serve as British military hospitals during the Crimean War. She probably would have met another Maryborough identity in John Evans, who used to crew on these ships and met Florence Nightingale on several occasions. John was also a member of the exploration that conveyed David Livingstone to the Congo. He lived in Maryborough and was a captain on the Llewellyn, which sailed the east coast of Australia. Eliza nursed soldiers in Smyrna, Scutari and Balaclava. It was reported that the rats encountered at Balaclava were bolder than they had ever been at Scutari. Other nurses came so used to them that they found it amusing and horrifying when fat nurse Barker, coming in exhausted after a climb up the hill to the quarters, fell panting on her bed and rose screaming to say that she had squashed 6 young rats. They were all immensely relieved when a non-commissioned officer gave them a little yellow cat. After the war, from about 1860 to 1869, Eliza was appointed to the position of matron aboard the immigrant vessels to Australia. She served on 9 different vessels, including the Lady Macdonald, the Annie Wilson, the General Caulfield, Queen of the Colonies, the Sirocco and the Shakamakson. Her last voyage as matron was on the ship the Light Brigade in 1869. It was on this voyage that she was to make a lasting friendship with Caroline Bell, who later became Mrs. George Willey of Maryborough. In 1871, aged 65, Eliza was appointed as the First Lady Superintendent of the Rockhampton Orphanage, a position which she held for 15 years. She did her duty thoroughly, even to whopping the unruly boys. It was reported in newspapers of the day that the orphanage seemed more of a home than an institution for its 68 children under the care, and that Matron Barker was loved by the children who, although regarding her word as law, saw her as a friend and not someone to be dreaded. The Telegraph newspaper of the 10th of May 1887 describes a visit to Maryborough Hospital, where Eliza met with a veteran from the Crimea who was a patient there. The two were able to share memories of their time during that dreadful war. Sadly, Eliza passed away a spinster in July 1888, aged 82, at the home of her friends Mr. and Mrs. George and Caroline Willey of Zante Street, her cause of death being recorded as senile decay. She is buried in the Monumental Cemetery at C211, though her memorial is located at C1182. Secondly, tonight we feature the Gurman family, a well-known name in the town. Eliza Baker married Nicholas Gurman in 1870. They had 5 children together before the sad passing of Nicholas in 1877. Eliza was left to raise her young children on her own. The entire family were staunch supporters of the Labor Party, and Eliza, although living a difficult life on her own, was noted for her philanthropic actions. Her only daughter, Catherine Magdalene Gurman, known as Lena, born in 1871, was to become a female political organiser. Lena was regarded as a very motivated person, being involved in numerous union movements. She also worked as a Labor Party organiser. She was involved in the defence of the shearers in the shearers' strike, helped with the sugarcane workers who were being expected to work for wages paid to the Kanakas, and she was tireless in her efforts to get all workers to join a union. She was a suffragette in the times when women of the world were fighting for the right to have a vote. Her name can be found on the electoral rolls for the first election in which they voted in 1905. Due to her outspoken ways, she was regarded by many as a communist. Lena had been in poor health for considerable time, having been in Brisbane Hospital, where she underwent a major operation. She came home to Maryborough, living with her mother at 42 Adelaide Lane, near the water tower. But she again became sick after having more surgery and died from a bowel obstruction on the 9th of January 1916 at the age of only 45. Her headstone reads, "Erected by the member of the Maryborough Workers' Political Organisation to the memory of Comrade M.K. Lena Gurman in recognition of her sacrificing devotion to humanity's great cause. She did her duty as she saw it and nobly, gentle to hear, kindly to judge." Another sad event for the family was that Lena's brother John passed away unexpectedly just 3 weeks after her on the 8th of February 1916. In 1914, he had served as president of the Engine Drivers, Firemen and Cleaners Association Maryborough branch and represented that body several times at conferences in Brisbane. Our final personality of the night is John Knight. John Knight was born 22nd of November 1834 in Devon, England. Although not receiving a formal education, John was apprenticed as a stonemason, like his father before him, until he joined the Royal Navy at age 18 in 1852. His service took him to the Baltic, India, China, Mediterranean and the Bahamas. He left the Navy in 1867 and returned home to England to work as a stonemason. He married Emma Puckey on the 20th of August 1868 at Old Church, St Pancras in London. John and Emma left London on the 3rd of November 1875 aboard the immigrant ship Indus, bound for Queensland. The couple settled in Maryborough, where John continued his calling as a stonemason. His business, Maryborough Stoneworks, was located on the corner of Alice and John Streets and is responsible for many of the fine monuments of our heritage-listed cemetery. John advertised that he was able to produce tombs, crosses, pulpits, stones, fonts and tables in marble, freestone and bluestone. He could also make stone and marble chimney pieces, cast iron grave railings, hearths, hobs, grindstones, as well as stone and slate water troughs. In 1891, the 8-hour demonstration and procession was fittingly closed by a dray on which a large marble cross from John Knight was displayed. Such was the standard of John's monumental works that commissions were received for his work from all over Australia, as well as from past residents who had returned to England. Some of the stones in our monumental cemetery crafted by John include the family stone of the Harrington family, William Frederick Harrington being the chairman of directors of Walkers Limited. This fine brown marble stone is erected on a 3-tier plinth depicting faith, hope and charity. A tall broken column signifies a life cut short, the first burial being his 18-year-old son, also called William. Yet the height of the column is a sign of the family's wealth. Another stone of interest crafted by Knight is that of James Cheam, who died in 1883. James, who was born in China, became our first alderman of Chinese descent in 1861. His headstone, with its similar shape to a human head and shoulders, gives credence to cemeteries being haunted. On a moonlit night and a quick glance, perhaps one could be forgiven for seeing a human form. I would like to believe that John Knight was responsible for crafting his own memorial. Although now lying in a state of disrepair, it is a fitting testament to a man whose life involved the sea. An intricately crafted anchor affixed with a chain to a cross, the anchor symbolising the life of a seaman and the chain around meaning a former member of the Navy, with the cross being an enduring symbol of Christian faith. The cross is also inscribed with IHS, which is the first 3 letters of Jesus' name in the Greek alphabet. It is commonly interpreted as in hoc signo, which is Latin for "by this sign we conquer." The curbing around the monument is in the shape of waves. Although John was always had a leaning towards writing, it wasn't until he came to Maryborough that he started to write seriously. Many of his sonnets can be found printed amongst the pages of the Maryborough Chronicle and Wide Bay Bernard Advisor. His love of the sea never wavered, and many of his poems reference this. In 1896, his poem "Steer for the Light" was set to music by Mr. George Rankin of Bundaberg. Mr. Reinhold Geiger of Maryborough also set Mr. Knight's verse "The Driver" to music in 1897. His major works, One People, One Destiny in 1894 and The Cruise of the Scout, 1899, are both held in the National Library as important works. He was referred to as Maryborough's patriotic poet. John passed away from heart disease on the 23rd of August 1901, aged 66 years, at his home, Devonshire Cottage on Fort Street. John's funeral was held on Sunday, the 25th of August 1901, and he was buried with naval honours. His burial record from J. Kirk and Sons Funeral Directors shows that his body was wrapped in a shroud and buried in a cedar coffin with silver embellishments. Notices were also placed in 2 newspapers. He left his estate of £310 in realty and £185 personality to his widow Emma. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you.
Our last speaker is Ian Brown. Ian is a writer, performer and arts advocate born in Maryborough. His plays include Reading Patrick, The Valley Member and Walking by Appletree Creek. In 2015, his solo performance, What the River Told Me, was first performed in this very venue when refurbishment began back in 2015. More recently, after returning to live here, he became better known to the Maryborough community as the Maryborough storyteller. He has worked extensively with the Fraser Coast Regional Council on a number of heritage-related projects, including the Bond Store, Customs House, the ongoing streetscape regeneration in the Maryborough CBD and the Story Bank. So please welcome Ian.
Thank you. There were too many great stories to pick out just 3 stories, but I have done it, but they're not my favourite stories. They're just 3 stories that happen to be on my desk at the moment for various reasons, and they've got the sparks of stories in them, and I hope you'll see them. I thought I'd start with a story of one of my ancestors, because I'm very proud of my ancestry here in Maryborough. My mother was a Melksham, which is a name well known in Maryborough. Now, the name originates in the ancient market village of Melksham on the River Avon in Wiltshire. One of my 16 great-great-great-grandfathers was reputed to be a foundling, left on the doorstep of the local manor house and named George for the king at the time, and Melksham for the town where he was born. Now, the first Melksham to arrive in Maryborough, setting foot in the New World just outside those doors there, was George's grandson, Frank Melksham, eldest son of Edwin and Mary Melksham. 18 when he set out from Plymouth on the Scottish Wizard, and 19 when he arrived here in January 1882. Frank was the advance scout for the rest of his family, mother and father, and 8 other siblings who would arrive 6 months later aboard the Silver Eagle. Now, Frank had been an apprentice bootmaker when he left England, and he was a rather serious young man, quite interested in a new form of religious ministry, the Salvation Army, a street ministry for the poor and homeless in England. Soup, soap and salvation was one of the first cries of the Salvos. Now, the rest of the Melksham family are Baptists, and high Baptists at that. Now, Frank sets to work here after he arrives, and he secures a little cottage out in Sydney Street off the Saltwater Creek Road. Now, it's unknown what his father Edwin had to say once he saw it. The proximity to the creek, it was right at the end of Sydney Street there, and the flat, almost basin-like lowland that it sat in. But I sense that something came between father and son at that point. There's a photograph with Frank looking a little disaffected off to the side of the family, but coming events would certainly show up his disastrous choice
in real estate. And yet if he hadn't have chosen where he did, I might never have eventuated, because Sydney Street was where the Melksham family would meet Carl and Emily Sengstock, the German family next door, and Frank's younger brother, my great-grandfather Bill Melksham, would marry their daughter Annie Sengstock. Now Frank started with the Salvos in 1891, and for the first 5 years he would be one of the dominating personalities of the Australian Guards Band, touring Australia, playing his E-flat cornet. So it's unlikely he was even here in Maryborough during the Great Flood of 1893, which isolated the low-set cottage in Sydney Street. Now Edwin, the fire and brimstone Baptist, his father, the man who would soon introduce to Maryborough the idea that the English were one of the lost tribes of Israel, got very biblical about his family's confinement to the cottage during the flood, which was actually 3 separate floods across a nearly 3-week period. So they were confined there for quite some time. Now for many years Edwin would be a thorn in the side of many a Maryborough town and city councillor and mayor, with his letters of complaint about the new town drainage system. Years later they would move the cottage by Bullock Dray around the corner to the top of the block that they owned there, the corner of Palace and Arbury Streets, and raise it up 6 feet. Now it served very well a large Melksham clan in Maryborough for many years to come, and the property was later owned by my mother's cousin Sid Melksham, who demonstrated a much better judgment for real estate than his great-uncle Frank, since his development of the Eurong Resort and Village on Fraser Island from the late 1950s yielded many millions when he finally sold it. Now Siddy died just last year, but that's another story, and it's part of the reason why I was telling the story. The first Melksham in, and Siddy is the last one to go so far. Now when Frank Melksham died in 1933 as a brigadier of the Salvos, his wife Annie, also a brigadier, had this to say: "His religion was the sunniest thing in life, and his passing was like the close of a delightful summer's day." So that's Frank the Salvo. Of course, Frank and Edwin, the Baptist, and most of the family, of course, were non-drinkers, supporters of the temperance movement. In Maryborough, the Wowsers, as they were universally called, were confronted quite literally with a hotel on every corner, and some in between. It's sad to see so many of our iconic hotels closed up, but there is some cause for optimism with the Royal Hotel. Now the Royal replaced an earlier hotel called the Bush Inn that had been taken apart out at the old village and rebuilt on the current site in 1856. Now Edgar Aldridge was the hotelier, but by 1873 the old Bush Inn had become the Royal Hotel, and it was acquired by an English carpenter and his wife, who'd come first to, Moreton Bay first, and then to Gympie. They had a hotel in Gympie, and before coming on to Maryborough. Now this was Richard Matthews Hine, or R.M. Hine as he was known, and his wife Elizabeth. Now the Royal was a double-storey wooden hotel, and the Hines set about making it the best hotel in town, if not the whole colony. It's likely to have been the Hines who planted the very famous row of bunya pines that fronted Kent Street for many years, until the hotel was later redeveloped. Now firstly they remodelled the interior of the hotel, him being a carpenter, and they're the first hotel in Maryborough to have a dedicated bathroom, and with earth closets, not water closets, but earth closets in every single room. A finely crafted billiard table was imported from Melbourne, and it formed the centrepiece of a saloon that was described as the most elegant and comfortable in the colony. With a porter and a buggy meeting every steamer down here at the wharf, and as the booking agent for the Cobb and Co coaches running between the goldfields of Gympie and Maryborough that stop right outside the Royal, it's soon the most popular hotel in town. Elizabeth is the excellent manager, affording Richard the chance to indulge his passion for racing thoroughbred horses, as well as shooting at game birds, for which he also keeps purebred dogs. Elizabeth also proves herself a brave and worthy neighbour when, in company with two of her maids, she salvages most of Georgie Stewart's stock of drapery before his premises burnt to the ground, along with that entire block of Kent Street in the Great Fire of 1876. Now, Richard was co-opted to council in 1877, was mayor in 1878, but declined that job the next year because of his new role as the prime mover in getting the grammar school built up, and both grammar schools, in fact, where they still stand today. Now, very sadly, Elizabeth dies in childbirth in the same year, 1879, and it has a very profound effect on Richard. He gives up the licence of the hotel, probably couldn't bear to see the place, but he keeps ownership of it, and he develops a large block of land that he'd also bought from Edgar Aldridge in what was then Maryborough's dress circle, probably still is today, Point Lookout. He subdivides this block and he creates a street down the middle of it that is named Elizabeth, as it is to this day. Of course, it is for his timber mill down here, begun on the site of an earlier mill in 1882, for which the Hine name will become so very famous here. But it is for something else Richard does in 1890, for which I think he deserves much wider recognition. As one of two members for Maryborough in the Queensland Colonial Government in 1890, Richard rises to his feet in the Parliament. It is incontrovertible that women are born equal to men. There should be no taxation without representation. Women are subject to the laws, yet have no say in making them. They may own property and run businesses, so why should they not be enfranchised to vote? The notions that giving the vote to women would make them less womanly, or that their delicate constitutions would be challenged by the robust nature of political life, are plainly ridiculous. With these words, Richard becomes the first MP in the world to introduce a private member's bill for the enfranchisement of women, a landmark in the suffragist and feminist movements, I think you'll agree. His motion, however, is greeted with disdain, and it's defeated by many fellow members, some of whom express disbelief at his seriousness. Hine simply claims to be complying with the wishes of his numerous friends, most of them made here in Maryborough. Returning his attention to the Royal Hotel at the turn of the century, Richard commissions plans for a complete rebuild in the grand style he had always envisaged. Just as the project is completed in early July 1902, the same year women are given the vote in Australia, Richard Matthews Hine, a few days short of his 63rd birthday, will die suddenly of a hemorrhage in the lung. Nearly 2,000 people turn out the next day to pay their respects to one whom they recognise as one of our most industrious citizens, and no doubt a very proud old builder. Now, the protagonist of my third tale of this town was a guest at this same Royal Hotel when visiting in July 1881. His visit coincided with the Wide Bay Show and the Wide Bay Winter Racing Carnival. He was a very proper Englishman, James Hawtry, the brother of the later famous actor Charles Hawtry, and he was in Australia as the escort to a rich young American called H.J. St. John, or St. John, who had bought the gate at the races for £300, and with more than 2,000 people turning up each of 2 days, had made himself a profit of £107. Anyway, Mr. Hawtry sets out from the Royal Hotel just before 9 p.m. on Thursday, July 21, 1881. He's heading to the race ball at the old town hall, the first one, the Palace of Timber and Tin beside the School of Arts. Now, the ball had been organised by Mina Rawson as the culminating activity of a fortnight of fun and frivolity she called the Crown Club. Now, Mina Rawson, some might recall, was the author of the first Australian cookery book to be written by a woman and published here by John Hosborough in 1878. The Crown Club was a way for her and her country friends to rent a large house in Maryborough, which actually ended up being a freshly built but unlicensed hotel, and come to town for a good old knees-up for the show and for the races. They'd all have a great lark. And now, sadly, it was all drawing to a close with a fancy dress ball planned at very short notice. A touring Austrian band was hired, and since the Kelly Opera Company were also in town doing Pinafore at the Temperance Hall of all places, but also a new German opera with a Turkish theme, many stock costumes were hired out to the visitors and the locals so they could all go to fancy dress. Now, James Hawtry decides to go to the ball as Pygmalion, after the mythical Greek king and sculptor, famously not interested in women, who carved his own beautiful lover out of stone. And Hawtry has just the costume that he needs. A loosely draped garment of cream chiffon, hemmed in gold embroidery, that today would be a bit like a Greek tunic, I suppose. Short tights were added that covered the thighs, but the lower legs and the arms were left bare. He teamed this with gold sandals, popped on a garland, and wahey, he's ready for the ball. Now, Hawtry gets out into Kent Street under the light of the moon and underneath the shade of those bunya pines, and he starts to sing in his happiness. Now, he attracts a lot of attention, particularly from a newly arrived Irishman, a police constable, no less. "And where might you be bound for, me man?" "I am on my way to a ball." "Oh, you're on your way to a ball, are you? Now, well, suppose you come and find some clothes to cover you before you disgrace yourself and the whole town in that rig." "Don't you know what a ball is? A fancy dress ball. Come, be reasonable. I am a stranger here." "Yes, begob, you're all that and a lot more. Sure, I'm bothered to know what to do with you." "Look, my man, my name is Hawtry. At the present moment, I am in fancy dress as Pygmalion. I don't suppose you know who Pygmalion was?" "No, I don't. Now, if you said your name was Pig-Femalion, I'd have believed you." "Why, man, you're close up mother naked. You're a disgrace to yourself and the public. Now come around the corner there and we'll find a nice little coat to cover your indecency." "Good heavens, man, I am as properly clothed as you are. Don't you understand? I am in fancy dress." "Begob, you're in fancy undress, I'm thinking. Where do you come from at all? Why, I don't believe you've got on so much as a rag of pants." And the policeman blows his whistle for assistance, and a great crowd had gathered, and another constable soon joins the fray. "Did you ever see the like? He thinks he's pigged somebody, and look at him. Why, he'd make a crow blush at the bare legs of him." And at this point, Hawtry considers that he would cut and run from the two constables, but being in a strange town, he didn't know where he might run to. Well, one of the crowd comes to his assistance and pipes up saying that there's a fancy dress ball at the town hall, so why not take him along there and ask them, "Is it in that rig you'd have us take him along the streets of the town?" Well, Mr. Hawtry now shakes his fist in the face of the constable, telling him what he thought of him, the town he was in, and the town he was born in. "Big gob, your mother naked me, man. Your indecency is screaming at you." Well, by this time they're at Town Hall, and Mrs. Rawson is called out to identify the poor fellow, which she did, and the constables went away, both of them still scandalised. Now later, Mr. Hawtry entertained the company of the ball at supper with his finely honed reenactment of the interlude, and it was remembered by many all their lives, all of those lines in fact coming from people's remembrance of that story. A write-up of that ball was published 2 days later in the Chronicle. Where else? An animated, picturesque, kaleidoscopic scene of such an entertaining character as has not been seen in Maryborough before. Probably no fancy ball has yet been given in Queensland which could be said to surpass in its pleasing variety and animation. Thank you for listening.